Lekuta Sichas Chelek Yud Tes Devarim Aleph. We're starting a new sefer today, even though we didn't finish the previous Sfarim yet. But as we start a new sefer, it's a new haschala and a new opportunity to get learning, involved in the learning, to grow in the learning. Be'ezras Hashem. The sikha that we're going to learn today is very, very interesting sikha, very powerful sikha, that's going to zero in on the concept of Moshe Oyev Yisrael Hoya. In the Farbrengen, this is the Farbrengen, Ashvuas Farbrengen. The Rabbi spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu and David the Melech and the Baal Shem Tov, all of whom are connected to Shavuos. Spoke about the common denominators between them. One of them being that they all excelled in their Avas Yisrael. It's actually interesting in the Farbrengen. The Rabbi brings out that how do we know that Moshe was Ne'ev Yisrael? So one of the ways is from the Baitusi, which we're going to learn about today, that he said Moshe Ne'ev Yisrael Hoya. Another way that we know is because the Gemara in I don't remember which Gemara it is, but the Gemara says that Yeshua Ne'ev Yisrael Hoya. And the yes, that Yeshua was the Yamis B'Teichayel, and everything that Yeshua had came from Moshe Rabbeinu. So if Yeshua is a Ne'ev Yisrael, then for sure Moshe Rabbeinu was a Ne'ev Yisrael. And this is one of the ways that Rebbe learns in the Farbrengen how we know that Moshe was a Ne'ev Yisrael. But today's Sikha is going to explore what does that mean. Sometimes Avas Yisrael is expressed in an open way when things are given, when there's chesed. And sometimes Avas Yisrael is expressed in a more difficult way, in a way where you have to do the right thing for the other person, even though it's not the easy thing for the other person. And this is what it's going to boil down to understand what Moshe Ne'ev Yisrael Hoya means, what is the approach of Torah. Do we take the approach that everything comes from Hashem and everything is given to us on a silver platter? Or do we take the approach that we have to work for it? And that's when we truly appreciate it, and that's when we truly become something meaningful to us. Anyway, before I digress too much, let's begin. Before we get to this Gemara that's going to discuss the Avas Yisrael of Moshe Rabbeinu, we're going to begin with a pasuk from our parsha that is used in that Gemara. So let's start from the beginning. The second pasuk of this week's parsha, after Moshe Rabbeinu gives the Teichacha, rebukes the Yidden in the first pasuk about various different things that they experienced along the journey in the past 40 years in the Midbar. The second pasuk says that it took 11 days, or it takes 11 days to go from Chayriv, which is where Har Sinai is, Derech Har Seir, taking the route of Har Seir, Ad Kadesh Barnea, until Kadesh Barnea, which was right near Eretz Yisrael. It takes 11 days. Zogin Chazal, and Rashi brings this up in Perush Shel HaTorah. So the Chazal tell us, and Rashi brings it down, as dem Weg von Chayriv bis Kadesh Barnea, was is Mehalach Yid Alev Yom. This route from Chayriv till Kadesh Barnea, which takes 11 days, so in Eden durchgegangen a 3 Tag. The Yidden traveled it in 3 days. Und Moshe Rabbeinu hat der mit Mosif gewen noch an Inyan von Teichacha. And Moshe Rabbeinu, by saying this, is adding one more topic to the rebuke that he gave. The Rashi is masbir. Amar la Moshe said to them, Ruma garamtem, look what you caused. Ein lechem derech k'sarim echerev l'kadosh Barnea. K'derech Har Seir, there's no shorter route from Chayriv to Kadesh Barnea. K'derech Har Seir, like the route of Har Seir. V'yafu ma'alach yid alef yom, and this shortest route takes 11 days. V'atem alachtem oiseh b'shleisha yomim, and you traversed it in 3 days. Rashi makes the cheshbon of how we know that the travel was only 3 days, and in Ha'ara 6, the Rebbe discusses it at length, exactly explaining the cheshbon of Rashi and learning various different things from the cheshbon. The kol kach hoyso shchina mislabetes b'shvilchem. So much the shchina was, so much effort the shchina was investing for you. L'mayir biyaschem la'oretz, to hasten your arrival to the land of Eretz Yisrael. And because you acted improperly, and this is a reference to the chet of the Miraglim, you traveled around and around Har Seir for 40 years. The Lashon Rashi is mashma. From what Rashi is telling us, it seems to imply, as the Ikir Adgosha in der Teichicha, the emphasis here is nit azevas bishvil shekel kaltem es auf Eden nigze geworden zu seine Midbar 40 Jahr anstatt zu gehen gleich in Israel. We're not so much focusing on the fact that because of their improper conduct, the Yidden were forced to stay in the Midbar for 40 years. Nor derin was bishvil shekel kaltem is geworden die halicha beoifen heipich. Ha'oifen, was heisse Schchina mislabetes chulu, lemaer biyaschem la'oretz, mit an iber natirlichem mehirus. The problem over here was that because of your inappropriate or your misconduct, the way you traveled was opposite of what the Schchina was trying to do. To hasten your arrival to Eretz Yisrael with a supernatural speed. Und lefizeh is achad asayim mecherev as the derech zwischen cherev and kodesh barnei is ma'alachid alef yom. Therefore, it comes out at this point that it takes 11 days to go from cherev to kodesh barnei is not a hagdama to the gufatechecha. Is only an introductory fact to the main point of the rebuke. The main point of the rebuke is that it could have taken 3 days. I mean, it did take 3 days, which shows that the Eibishter was ready to take you to Yisrael very quickly. So how did you cause this? Would you cause for it to take 40 years? But this is nitgratik. If this is the pshat, then there's a question here. Was we true to the true fact, true to accept that the fact that it took them 3 days is part of what Moshe is trying to tell them, and part of what he's including in the rebuke. But why do you have to say, with we understand the Rashi, that the main point of the rebuke here is that it could have taken, that from the fact that it took 3 days, it shows that there was the Eibishter wanted to go in a super speed. Und das, was steht befehlisch in Pasuk, als der Derech von Cherev bis Kodesh Barnei as Ma'alachid alef yom, is not a hagdama tzmetzma teichecha. And then that would imply that the fact which the detail which the Pasuk does say explicitly, that it took 11 days to travel, that's only the introductory fact. In other words, according to the way we're understanding Rashi, the Pasuk says it took 11 days. But the teichecha, the main part of the teichecha is that it took 3 days. So why would you say that the detail that is written in the pasuk, that's the introductory fact, and the detail that is not written in the pasuk, that's the main emphasis? It should be the opposite. The detail that's in the pasuk, that would be the main emphasis, and the other details could be an introductory fact or a side fact. So how exactly are we understanding this Rashi, where Rashi seems to place an emphasis on the Gimel Yomim, on the 3-day journey? Is there fun mashma? So therefore we must conclude, as this is nit shaykh in dem kein sufficient, there was no middle road here. There's no normal. Zeir alichi in midbar kan sein oder in an Eifen von the Meier biyaschem la'aretz. The journey through the midbar could have been in one of two ways. Either in the super fast speed that the Eibishter is going to hasten their arrival to Eretz Yisrael, or in an Eifen hafchi, or the opposite. Gedoyren zu lieb die Chatoim von Eden iber natirlich memshana, that it should be delayed unnaturally for 40 years. It could either be the miraculous way of 3 days, super speed, or an unnatural long delay. Und der Rebbe hat Moshe die zwei Jahren zu Nev gebunden zusammen beim Shechach. And therefore Moshe brings together both of these details in one continuation. If it's not going to be the miraculous 3 days, it's going to be the opposite. And therefore, when the pasuk says the words 11 days, there is no chance of them traveling in 11 days. It's either 3 days or 40 years. So the pshat and the Rashi is that Rashi is telling us that the teichecha over here from Moshe was that hayitochen, you caused this to be 40 years when it could have been done in 3 days. The fact that it takes 11 days is what the pasuk mentions. That is intrinsically connected with the fact that it actually took 3 days, because there was no middle road. It's either 3 days or 40 years. That's the understanding of the Rashi. Ad Kan is the Rashi. We learned the pasuk, the Rashi, and the way the Rebbe understands the Rashi, that Moshe was telling them it could either be 3 days or 40 years. Beis. Sif Beis, we're going to introduce this Gemara in Menachos and this debate between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the Baitusi. Ha'amor, this which we just learned, as the halicha for Yidden in Midbar Shayach not of einem from the Tzvei Yefanim, that the journey of Yidden through the desert is possible in only one of two ways. Hafachim, and now one of these two totally different opposite ways. This will also help us understand Teisvis, in Gemara, which Teisvis is explaining a questionable statement in the Gemara. The Gemara is sagt, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gata vikuach mit Baitusi wegen ze Yeshit. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a debate with a Baitusi. Baitusi was a member of a group of people called the Baitusim, which was similar to the Tzedukim. And their general approach was to not accept Torah Shebal Peh. They accepted Torah Shebiksav, the way they understood Torah Shebiksav, but the written Torah, but the Torah Shebal Peh, they did not believe in it. And this led to a number of different disagreements between the Tzedukim and Baitusim and the Chachamim of the time. So one of the issues over here was when is Shavuos? Their shitta was, as Atzeres is Alam al Achar Shabbos. The Atzeres Shavuos is always on Sunday. They explain that you should count the Omer the day after Shabbos. This Shabbos means Shabbos of the week, Shabbos of the 6 days of the week. Shabbos Bereshis over here doesn't mean Shabbos Parshas Bereshis, but Shabbos of Sheishas Yimei Bereshis, meaning the 7th day of the week. And therefore, if you start counting Sfiras Eimer on Sunday, then Shavuos is going to be on Sunday 7 weeks later. And of course, the Chachamim hold that Mimachras HaShabbos means Mimachras Yontif, which regardless of which day Yom Tov falls out, the next day you would start counting Sfira, and therefore 7 weeks later it will be Shavuos, even if it's a Tuesday, or whatever of the day it is. So, the Chachamim wanted to debate. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai led the debate. The Baitusi had getainet. So the Baitusi had the following claim. Moshe Rabbeinu Eiv Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was an Eiv Yisrael. He loved Yidden. And he knows that Shavuos is only one day, unlike Pesach and Sukkot that are 7 days or 8 days. So Yidden that are celebrating the Yom Tov have a chunk of time to celebrate. Shavuos is only one day. So Moshe Rabbeinu went and established that it should always be after Shabbos, meaning on Sunday, or Mitzvah Shabbos it should start. So Yidden could enjoy 2 days, have a 48-hour Yontif. That was the claim of the Baitusi. Moshe is in Yisrael, and certainly he would give them 2 days to have Shavuos. Shabbos and Sunday being Shavuos. The Rabbi Yochanan answers him, quoting the pasuk from our parsha that it takes 11 days to go from Cherev to Kadesh Barnea. They can conclude with the conclusion, and if you're right that Moshe Rabbeinu was Ne'ev Yisrael, why did Moshe Rabbeinu delayed the Yidden in the Midbar for 40 years? From the fact that it was Achadas Hayom, and it could have been 11 days, and instead it was 40 years. This calls into question, seemingly, this approach of Moshe Rabbeinu Yisrael. Is Teisvis Masber? Das was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hat ausgeklieben dafke dem Pasuk. Karal of Mikra Zeh. Why did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai use this Pasuk Achadas Hayom? For the Raya that Ichran by Midbar by Mishana the Moshe delayed the Yidden in the middle of 40 years. Adas is moved on late finish Rashi anal. That it's understood according to the Rashi that we have on our pasuk. As Adem Weg that an Yidden durchgegangen in 3 Tag. That Yidden traveled the 11-day journey in 3 days. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in this pasuk we see, and with this understanding of Rashi, we see Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's answer. Well, the Midah Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gemeint zu sagen. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying to the Baitusi, Why did he delay them 40 years? And he did not have, he was not successful in hastening the journey the way they did it in those 3 days, where they traveled an 11-day journey in 3 days. Tosfos over there mentions that Rashi over there doesn't mention the 3 days in the Gemara. He only mentions the 3 days here in Chumash. But in order to understand the Gemara there and why this pasuk is chosen, Tosfos uses Rashi's explanation in Chumash about the 3 days, that he could have done it in 3 days. And instead it took 40 years. So, but this Tosfos is still not fully explained. Why is it relevant that they weren't able to succeed to go to travel it in 3 days? The argument here was that it took 40 years. The fact that Moshe allowed it to take 40 years seemingly shows a lack of Moshe's Avos Yisrael. So the fact that it took 3 days or 11 days seems irrelevant to this taina of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So how does it help us to understand the 3 days? Al pi analober is this movement. But now that we understood this Rashi, now that we explained that this Rashi, it tells us that there's only 2 ways to go. Either it's 3 days or 40 years. So we understand that what the pasuk is saying, what the Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, is that it could have taken 3 days. When the fact that it's an 11-day journey is irrelevant. We just explained, because it would have never taken 11 days. It was either going to go this way or that way. So that's why he mentions the 3 days, because he's saying that they could have done it in 3 days, and instead it took 40 years. I know it's going through your head. It didn't answer the question yet. It's true that if there wasn't been the delay in the Midbar, then they would have gone in 3 days. They would have been successful. Not have gone in the normal speed, but gone in the extra fast speed of 3 days. Was ist aber negeya dos? So madgish sein in entfertzum by tusi bis as der far karol of mikra zedavke. It still doesn't explain how this talks to the Baitusi. In other words, in Siv Beis, you explain the pshat in the Tosfos. The pshat in the Tosfos is that it could have taken 3 days, and instead it took 40 years. And based on the fact that we understood the Rashi, that it's either 3 days or 40 years, the 11 days is not an option. So we understand why Tosfos goes to the 3 days, because that's the only other option. But the question is, what does this pasuk tell the Baitusi that he wouldn't know from somewhere else? Why is this the raya to the 40 years? And the fact that it could have taken 3 days doesn't change the fact that it actually took 40 years. So how does this prat of the 3 days answer the Baitusi's claim of Moshe Rabbeinu's Avos Yisrael? Muzman Zogin. This next paragraph is a key paragraph. As der Abschlag auf der Taine von Baitusi, that the refutation on the claim of the Baitusi, as mitzad Avos Yisrael amad Moshe v'tikna chashabes chulu, that the Baitusi claimed that Moshe Rabbeinu's Avos Yisrael led him to establish Shavuos on Sunday, is Taka von dem Inyan, was der Ichram am Midbar beim Shana hat verbieten, nicht nur der Alicha Regila in Eretz Yisrael, nur der Eifin von Itzlichu Olechas mit Amihirus Nisses. That the answer to the question, to the claim, is from the fact that the 40 years replaced the supersonic speed of 3 days. In other words, because it could have taken 3 days and instead it took 40 years, in that detail is going to lie the answer to the Baitusi. In other words, if it was 11 versus 40 days, if you were 40 years, if you were just saying, well, they were in the middle of 40 years, that would not have answered the Baitusi's claim. The fact that it could have taken 3 days and instead it took 40 years, there lies the answer to the Baitusi, and it's going to take us the next few seifim to work our way through that, to understand what exactly was his taina and what exactly was the response. But in order to get that, we first have to truly understand what was the Baitusi actually saying. What was he actually claiming about Moshe Rabbeinu establishing Shavuos on Sunday? So if he's going to let us know first, that first we have to give some credence to this, to the debate. The fact that Rabbi Yochanan is even talking to this person, and the fact that the Torah, the Gemara brings the discussion, means that there's some validity to the argument, at least in the seichel of Torah. At least in the way we could understand it, it makes sense what they're saying. And then we have to refute what they're saying because it's not really emes lamitosei of Torah. As it's spoken a number of times, it's spoken at length in a different sikha with regards to the various debates that we find in Shas between the Chachmei Yisrael and non-Yidden. Similarly, with the Baitusim, these debates, as does Gufe was Tanoim the very fact that they were debating with them, and more so the fact that the details of these debates were actually placed in the Torah, which is Torah's emes, and this compels us to say, as in Seichel HaTorah is done that in the Seichel of Torah, intellectually speaking, there is room, there is validity, there is legitimacy to their arguments, as the emphasis of Chachmei Yisrael. And certainly we must say that the answers of the Chachamim, that it needs are not just something to push them away. The argument of the Chachamim that are debating actually are truth, are 100% the truth with the authenticity of Teres Emes. So if there is some credence to the words, to the arguments of these debaters, then we can actually focus on the nuance in the words of the Baitusi. We didn't do that in our case. Moshe Rabbeinu Ohev Yisrael. The Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ohev Yisrael. Chulu. Shabbos. So he established Shavuos on Sunday after Shabbos. Das heißt, das Teile given nicht in dem Eibishten. Nur der Moshe Rabbeinu. The Baitusi is giving the credit not to the Eibishter for making Shavuos on Sunday, but to Moshe Rabbeinu. Mitzad Zayin Havas Yisrael had Moshe gemacht a takana that says Lach Shabbos, that Moshe Rabbeinu, because of his Ava to the Yidden, he made a new takana that it said that Shavuos should be on Sunday. For the Cheda, sein Shitte is a doch miyazat of Pasuk and Lach Shabbos. The Shitte of the Baitusi was based on the Pasuk. Mimachas Shabbos, which they translated to mean Shabbos Bereshis. Unitas is a takana from Moshe Rabbeinu. He wasn't coming from the fact that this was established by Moshe Rabbeinu. Ironically speaking, the Baitusim don't believe in Moshe Rabbeinu. So the question is, why is the Baitusi bringing in Moshe Rabbeinu if the proof comes from the pasuk, which is from the Eibishter? They bear in them, and the answer is as follows. Chazal bring in kama v'kama limudim mechachas as atzeres is chamishim yom from machras yom tevrishin shel Pesach. Chazal in that Gemara bring various different ways to learn and various different proofs that atzeres, that Shavuos is 50 days from the first day of Pesach and not from a Sunday. First of all, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai himself brings a raya because he says that one pasuk says Tisperu Chamishim Yom, the other pasuk says Sheva Shabbos is Tmimos. So are they Tmimos or are they Chamishim Yom? And therefore he says Kan B'Yom Tov Shechali is B'Shabbos, Kan Shechali Yom Tov Shechali is B'Emtzah Shabbos. When it says Sheva Shabbos is Tmimos, it's referring to Shabbos that's on the Yom Tov Pesach that starts on Shabbos. Then you count Sfira on Sunday. Then you have 7 whole weeks. And Kan, what is a Chamishim Yom, it doesn't say Tmimos, that is when you start counting in when Yom Tov is in the middle of the week, and you start counting in the middle of the week. And rather last year in Parashas Emor, we had a whole sikha about the concept of Tmimos. So, but after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai comes 4 more Amoraim that bring 4 more rayas that Shavuos is the middle of the week. So once you have proofs from the text of Torah that Shavuos is on Sunday, 50 days after, Shavuos is not on Sunday necessarily, but Shavuos is 50 days after the first day of Pesach. Und der Riber der Pirush, as Mochres HaShabbos main Shabbos Bereshis, can you say the Tiksuvi HaTeira? And therefore the approach of the Baitusim, that Mochres HaShabbos means the day of Shabbos, has no foundation, has no basis in the Psukim of Teira, because you want to talk Psukim, you have 5 different limudim and proofs in the Gemara from these Psukim that Mochas HaShabbos means Mochas Yom Tov. So clearly the Baitusi wasn't coming to argue with them Pshat and Chumash. Nor the Baitusi at Getainit, Baitusi came up with a new argument. Even though the Baitusi himself believes that Shavuos is on Sunday because he holds Mochas HaShabbos means Shabbos of the week. But nevertheless, the Baitusi comes, he says, I will argue from your approach. You believe in Moshe Rabbeinu. So even though Mochas HaShabbos might mean Taka, even though you might interpret it to mean middle of the week, but maybe Moshe Rabbeinu Mesakin given, Moshe Rabbeinu would change and be Mesakin as Atzeres al Alam al Chazan a Perganach Shabbos, that Atzeres at Shavuos should always be on Sunday. Das meint, wir soll machen die Kvius HaChadoshim in an Eufen, as der erste Tag Pesach soll Chal sein allemal bei Yom HaShabbos. Ubeloshna Yadua Ma'abenes Acheres L'Tzerach. The Bezdin has a right to, when they feel the need, to change, to add an extra month. Not only that, but sometimes it also, even in the days. In the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Rabbi brings this in the original, in the Farbrengen. In the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara talks about not making Yom Kippur on Friday or on Sunday. One reason is it shouldn't have 2 days of Shabbos or right at one after the other. One reason the Gemara brings over there is in case someone dies and they shouldn't be dead for 2 days without being buried. Another answer is the fresh vegetables. Another reason is fresh vegetables shouldn't get spoiled because they were plucked from the ground 2 days ago. So we see a discussion in the Gemara that you could, if necessary, the Bezdin has the right to schedule when the Shchodesh should fall out because of other certain things. So says the Baitusi, why can't you say that Moshe Rabbeinu was Mesakin, that Pesach should be on Shabbos? Azoi as beide Sachen werden stimmen, and then both approaches could fit. The Sfira is Sayim Achras Shabbos Bereshis, that the Sfira will start on Sunday, like the way the Baitusim claim. Und Sayim Achras Yom Tov, and also it'll also be the day after the first day of Pesach, which is how the Chachamim say it. Und der Tam von der Takana is, and why would Moshe Rabbeinu do that? So you shouldn't be able to celebrate for 2 days. As will be explained more at length in Sivav Zayin, was Pshat Misangin Shnei Yamim, and why would Moshe Rabbeinu do that? But the Baitusi is coming to say, even though I believe Mimochas Shabbos means Shabbos Bereshis, means that Shavuos has to be on a Sunday, but Moshe Rabbeinu was Nevi Yisrael, he loved the Yidden, and he knows how much the Yidden need to have Shavuos and Shabbos next to each other so that they can celebrate a 48-hour Yom Tov. So certainly Moshe Rabbeinu could have arranged the Kvius HaChodesh that Pesach should be on Shabbos. Und auf dem hat Rabbi Yochanan gesagt, noch ein Abschlag in dem Tamat HaKona. Von dem, was Ichlam mit Baral Boim Shana Kidla Kaman Siftes, Rabbi Yochanan Zakai, first, he refutes the reason. You're telling me that Moshe Rabbeinu is Nevi Yisrael. I'll tell you 1 second, look. Moshe Rabbeinu delayed the Yidden in the middle for 40 years. And in Siftes, we're going to explain how that is a response to Moshe Rabbeinu's Avos Yisrael. But then after that, Rabbi Yochanan Zakai gebracht a raya from Pasuk as es kenit zayin as a takana. He brings a proof from the Pasuk that this takana is not possible. Warum from Pasuk Zetman as a darfen zayin tzvei yifani kviyusen. From the Pasuk we see that there has to be 2 different types of calendars. Can be Yom Tov Shecholi is b'Shabbos. Sometimes Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, and then Sfira begins on Sunday, and then Shavuos is on Sunday as well. The can be Yom Tov Shecholi is b'Emtzah Shabbos, and this pasuk, the second pasuk, is referring to a Yom Tov that falls out in the middle of the week, and then the Sfira begins in the middle of the week, and then Shavuos is in the middle of the week. And so this is what Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is saying to the Baitusi. You're telling me that we should make it in a way that both approaches come out to be true. That Pesach is always on Shabbos, and therefore Sfira is always on Sunday, and then you have both approaches. From the Psukim, we see not like that. We see that there's sometimes a Kviyus where Yom Tov is B'Emtzah Shabbos, the middle of the week. So this is the discussion, the debate between Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai and the Baitusi. Baitusi is claiming that Moshe Rabbeinu was mesaken something to make it easier or more enjoyable for the Yidden, and because he's an Eiv Yisrael. And Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai says, first of all, your argument about Eiv Yisrael doesn't hold water. We'll soon see why. Second of all, the fact that you say that it should always be in this way, we see clearly from the Psukim that there's two different ways that Yom Tov could be. Sometimes Yom Tov is on Shabbos, Pesach, and sometimes Yom Tov is after Shabbos, is the middle of the week. So, in Sifei, we're going to address this glaring question. What is Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai saying about Moshe Rabbeinu's Ahavas Yisrael? The Baitusi is arguing that Moshe Rabbeinu is an Eiv Yisrael. And Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, what's he saying? That he's not an Eiv Yisrael. Based on what we said earlier, the details of the debate do have a place in the Seichel of Torah, even if they're not true in the end, but they can be discussed intellectually in Torah. We raise a very glaring and major question in the main point of this debate. The approach of the Baitusi is based on Moshe Rabbeinu being an Eiv Yisrael. When Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai sagt, Moshe Rabbeinu Eiv Yisrael, you b'lashon Tmiyah. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is sort of asking, if Moshe Rabbeinu is Eiv Yisrael, implying Chas v'Shalom that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is saying that he's not an Eiv Yisrael. How is that possible? How can we go on by understanding that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is claiming that he's not an Eiv Yisrael to a Baitusi who doesn't even believe in Moshe Rabbeinu and yet saying that he's an Eiv Yisrael? The Nekudas appear in them. This is another very fundamental shtickle in this sikh. When Yochanan Zakkai says that if Moshe Rabbeinu is an Eiv Yisrael, he doesn't mean to say that he wasn't an Eiv Yisrael. What he means to say, as Moshe Rabbeinu Ahavas Yisrael is neat in Aza'efen vider Baitusi yad banumen. That Moshe Rabbeinu's Ahavas Yisrael is not in the way that the Baitusi tried to grasp. Because Ahavas Yisrael is mechayiv di takana sheyu yustomas angin shtei yamim, which that approach, the approach of the Baitusi, his version of Ahavas Yisrael, would necessitate a takana that Yidden should be able to celebrate Shavuos for 2 days. Nor in Gagor, Anderin und Tiferen Eifen. Moshe Rabbeinu's Ahavas Yisrael is much different and much deeper. But Ahavas Yisrael is nit alamol asibas by Eden zal sein begodim misangin. And from that perspective, we doesn't always reach a point, at least in a revealed way, that the Yidden are enjoying. In other words, if you're looking at the enjoyment of the Yid, Lav Dafka, you're going to see that in Moshe Rabbeinu's Ahavas Yisrael. Sometimes the depth of Moshe Rabbeinu's Ahavas Yisrael is seen not in the Misangi, not in the enjoyment. Und der Ruf hat gebracht den Pasuk Achadas Yemechedef. And this is why Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai brings this Pasuk. But das ist von der Divrei Teichecha von Moshe, which this Pasuk is from the rebuke of Moshe. Begolu zet es ois wie an Inyan von an Einish. And superficially, it seems to be a negative consequence because they're of their misconduct. They ended up in the midbar for 40 years. But the truth is, as Dafke indeed divrei teichecha, that specifically in these words of rebuke, hat sich ausgedrückt die Größe und tiefe Ave von Moshe zu Yidden. This expressed the great, deep love that Moshe has to Yidden. Ubelashna Medrash, and as the Medrash says, Yichichan Moshe shayavan, that Moshe, because he loves them, he's the one who's going to rebuke them. So therefore, in the rebuke, you see the love. In the Rebbe's Farbrengen, He said, B'derech Agav, there's a hira, brura, a clear hira over here, that only someone who you love can you rebuke. If you have to rebuke, if someone needs to be rebuked, it can only be done by somebody who loves him or her. So, before we get into the explanation of this, let's make sure we understand this. What we're saying over here is that the Baitusi came and said that Moshe Rabbeinu is Eiv Yisrael, and therefore he was going to give the Yidden 2 days of Yontif. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, you have a very shallow understanding of Avos Yisrael, of Moshe Rabbeinu Avos Yisrael. The true Avos Yisrael of Moshe, the depth of Moshe's Avos Yisrael could sometimes bring to Teichecha. It could sometimes bring to a rebuke. But that is the truest, most and deepest, most form of Moshe's Avos Yisrael. And this is going to be explained further along in the Sikha. What we're going to do in Sivav and Zayin, and then Ches, is we're going to go deeper into the Taina of the Baitusi, and therefore into the response from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We're going to understand that this idea of the 2-day Yontif that Baitusim are talking about is actually reflective or representative of a much deeper approach that the Baitusim have to Yiddishkeit. The approach that the Baitusim have to Yiddishkeit is that it's ultimately all about what we're getting. What is the Eibishter giving us? What's the reward that we're getting? What are we getting for it? And we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's response is that Torah is not so much about what I'm getting, but what I'm doing, what I'm accomplishing, where am I investing my efforts. That's what Torah is all about, and that is where you see the difference of the Baitusi's understanding of Avos Yisrael and the real and true understanding of Moshe's Avos Yisrael. Sivav, Atzeres is verbunden mit Tzvira Iden Zelem Memtes Yem und der Yem HaChamishim is Atzeres. The whole Atzeres, which is the Yom Tov of Shavuos, is connected to Sfira. The Yidden count 49 days, and then the 50th day is Shavuos. Is Yodua, it's known from the Kuta Torah, from the Alter Rebbe, as the Memtes Yem was Yidden Seilen, Weisen auf Dargis, die Memtes She'orim, zu welche Yidden der Grechin, bekoyach vavedes atzmam. The 49 days of Sfira Sa'omer represent the levels, the 49 gates of which Yidden can reach through their own strengths and their own avodah. The five different they tzel the tag, and therefore they have to count the days to gauge what they've accomplished. Masha'enkin der Yom HaChamishim was gate nitaran in the Sfira for Yidden, but the 50th day, which is not part of the count of the Yidden only count 49 days. This represents a higher level, the 50th gate. Which is given to us from above. After accomplishing and reaching with as many levels as we can with our own efforts, with our own strengths, then we are given a gift from above, the 50th level. Sharanun. When a person sanctifies himself, when a person makes himself holy down below, even though it's just a little bit, then he is given holiness from above much more than he prepared himself, than he worked on. So too, when a Yid does everything that he can on his own, then he's given from above a gift that's way beyond the level that he was able to reach. Das is the Taina from Baitusi, and this leads to the argument of the Baitusi. Since the whole idea of Shavuos is something that's coming from above, so also the preparation to Shavuos should be something that does not so much emphasize the person's avodah, but emphasizes the kedusha, the holiness that comes from above. Where are you going to see that? In Shabbos. Shabbos is inherently holy, unlike Yom Tov, that its holiness is dependent on the Yidden, based on Kviyas HaChodesh, on Kiddush HaChodesh. If Shavuos, if Rosh Chodesh is on Sunday, then Sukkot is going to be on Sunday. If Rosh Chodesh is on Tuesday, then Sukkot is going to be on Tuesday. In other words, the day that becomes Yom Tov is dependent on the Yidden, on Bezdin. But Shabbos, every 7th day is Shabbos, regardless of what Bezdin has to say, because Shabbos is inherently holy. And therefore Shabbos is a day of pleasure, a day where we don't focus on toil and effort, because it has an inherent holiness. So the Baitusi is saying, what I need to do is I need to bring together Shavuos, which is Milamaila, and Shabbos, which is Milamaila. The free dike Darge Sfira Tag, seine Diachonot, seine Akelu zu der Darge Machamish Matzeres, was man geht Milamaila Sharanun. The earlier days of Sfira are a preparation to be able to be a receptacle, to be able to receive this highest 50th level, which is coming from above. Aber Atzeres Gufa is Acher von Avedas Adam. The 50th day itself, Shavuos itself, is beyond the reach of the person's Aveda. Und der Fall ist echt der Erev von Shavuos, the Tog Bismiches Mamis zu Atzeres, and therefore the Baitusi claims that the day immediately adjacent to Shavuos, Davka Azazman versus Amein von dem Ilu Yanal von Atzeres, Ema Shabbos, that day has to also be similar, carry the similar advantage to that of Atzeres, and the closest we can find to that is Shabbos. So the Baitusi is arguing that we need to have Shabbos right before Shavuos, because Shabbos is the proper achana to Shavuos, because Shavuos is Milamaila and Shabbos is Milamaila. And Zayin is going to say that it's not just about when Shavuos is. This is a general approach of the Baitusim to Torah. Chag HaShavuos is a chazman matan Torah seinu. Is that in and out benegetz atzeres erchda b'shidus Baitusim benegetz akolos in Torah. So this concept will also be applicable to the whole approach to Torah. Die Baitusim glauben, die Baitusim glauben not in Teresh V'Ksav, not in Teresh V'Alpeh. The Baitusim believe only in Teresh V'Ksav and not in Teresh V'Alpeh. The chilek between Teresh V'Ksav and Teresh V'Alpeh is the difference between the two. Teresh V'Ksav is a Kadosh Baruch Hu Eimer Moshe Kesef. The Eibishter speaks, Moshe writes it down. Sie is gegeben geworden in ganzem Elamayla. The Teresh V'Ksav comes entirely from above. Und in dem ist nicht als Negeya, die Avana Vasaga von dem was lernt here, and it's not so relevant the comprehension level of the learner. That's Teresh V'Ksav. It's about the fact that it comes from above. How much you can grasp, how much you can get, does not really affect Teresh V'Ksav. Which is why a person can make Birchas HaTorah on Teresh V'Ksav even if they don't understand. Because saying the very words that Hashem wrote, that is Teresh V'Ksav. Teresh V'Alpeh, on the other hand, is in Yonah, Teresh as it was transmitted into the comprehension of the people. As it's revealed and transmitted through the Chacham of every day. And there's supposed to be la fashalo, which means to enhance the learning, to add, so to speak, to the Torah. The learner has to toil, has to work hard with his intellectual faculties to be able to innovate in Torah. Teresh V'Ksav, you can't add one letter, you can't take away one letter. It has to be exactly perfectly the way the Eibishter gave it. So there's two differences. Number one, that Teresh V'Ksav is not about comprehension. And number two, Teresh V'Ksav cannot be changed from the way the Eibishter wrote it. Teresh V'Alpeh, it is about comprehension, and you could, so to speak, add to it if the person learns and makes chidushim. The Baitusim glauben not in Teresh V'Ksav. But now that we understand that the Baitusim wanted to do Shavuos next to Shabbos because they wanted to emphasize that which comes Milamayla, the Baitusim have the same approach to Teresh V'Ksav. They believe only in Teresh V'Ksav. They halten as Torah is no does what's come begoli Milamayla. The Torah consists of that which comes down from above. That which was given to us in a revealed, open, tangible way from above, that is Torah. So therefore they applied the same thing to Matan Torah. Und das ist die Teine von die Baitusim. And this was their claim. As mitad Avos Yisrael hat Moshe Mesaken given as Atzeret Matan Torah Zachar Shabbos. That Moshe Rabbeinu, because of his Avos Yisrael, would establish Shavuos to be on Sunday. Noch hatog v'chis on omol v'yagia. After a day that does not have toil or effort, nor tainug, a day that is that is exclusively for pleasure. Migit alts milamayla, a time that everything's from above. Basically, the Baitusim have the approach that Yiddishkeit and Torah is that which comes from above. It's not so much. We'll see the opposite way the opposite approach in Sivches. But for now, therefore they believe that whatever came from above, that is Torah Shebiksav. The day of Shavuos is the day that comes from above, and even Erev Shavuos has to be something that comes from above, because that's what Torah is all about to them. The remes is aber. The truth is up. The truth, however, is as eich teres v'alpeh is gegeben geworden b'Sinai, that even teres v'alpeh also comes from Sinai. Even that which human beings are able to grasp with their own intellect, that is also part of the Torah of Hashem. Das ist Torah, das ist wie Torah, is that gekommen bis lapsus lamata, bis as a nivra was keine verstehen. It's just that this is an aspect of Torah that came down into this world, so that a nivra, a human being, should be able to understand it. And it is this part of Torah, the Torah that is understandable and graspable by the human being, that actually is where is expressed the ultimate intent of Matan Torah. As so sein der Chibur, Elyon v'tachten, that there should be the connection between the above and below. When a man shahar mit eis mit sein seichel asvara in Torah, when a person works through with his own seichel to be able to understand or even introduce a new idea, a concept in Torah, is Torah's havaya. The Torah of Hashem becomes considered the person's Torah. Thus, for sein der Aninin, it becomes his own thing. And now he brings in this idea of Tisha Kav Shochavere. The Gemara of Metzia says, that a person prefers one kav of his own than 9 kavim of his friend. Even though 9 kavim is more, but the one that he worked on is his, and therefore he appreciates it more. So similarly over here, that which comes from above, it might be Tisha Kabin, it might be a lot more in quantity, but it doesn't have my own personal stamp on it. But the Torah that I learn and that I understand, it might be much less, just a kav, but it has my entity stamped on it, and therefore I can connect to the Eibishter through it. It's not as much as the 9 kavin that come from above, from the Eibishter. The far over is as kav shaloi, but on the other end it's his own kav, it's his own portion. Und durch dem wird sein Metzias. And therefore his person could become one with the Eibishter's chachma in an incredible oneness. So this idea that the Yebaitusim have, that they only want Torah Shebiksav because it comes milamayla, they miss the point. The whole point is Torah the way it comes lamata, the way the human being can develop and become one with Torah through their own seichel. And now to bring this back to the day of Shavuos. How does this apply to the day of Shavuos? And since the whole intent and the purpose of Matan Torah is to bring together the above and below, that even those ideas that are inherently higher, beyond the ability of the human to grasp, ultimately they have to be grasped in the seichel of the person, because there has to be a chibur, there has to be a connection between the above and below. So therefore this must tell us that the fact that before Matan Torah there has to be the preparation of Sfiras HaEmer, the Yegiyah V'Avedis Adam to Zayin Roitz K'Rolas HaTorah, which refers to the person's effort and toil to be prepared for the receiving of the Torah, is this Negeya in dem Gufin of Matan Torah. It's actually necessary for the very idea of Matan Torah. Biz, the Chassidus touched up the meaning from Tisperu Chamishim Yom, to the point that Chassidus explains what does it mean to count 50 days, as Eden Machin Uf, that Yidden bring into being and illuminate the 50th day. Meaning to say, the word tisperu comes from the word F and sapir, literally means a sapphire stone, but it comes from the word a shining stone. That tisperu means they make light, they illuminate the 50th day. Die Hamschache von dem Shara Nun, was wird das Galet Matentede, wird aufgetan durch der Arbeiter von Iten bis Firis Eimer. Und der Rieber ist, dass die Richtige Chanetz Matentede. The Yidden, they're the ones who make the 50th day. Even though we said before earlier in the Sikha that the Shara Nun is coming with Lamaila, but since the whole Aveda is Chibur Elin V'Tachtein, so Yidden can have an impact even on the Shara Chamishim. They can affect even the Shara Chamishim. So it's not totally Milamayla, it's also somewhat coming through Aveda Sa'adim. Therefore, the proper Achanat Matan Torah is not Shabbos, not Mekacha V'Kaima, but the proper Achanat of Shabbos is Aveda B'Kayach Atzmei Aveda V'Sfiras Eimer. And there's a word that I didn't see it here in the Sikha, but in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe adds it that therefore, even in a year when Shabbos does fall out of Shavuos, we can understand that since some years this doesn't happen, and this is what he said earlier, Rabbi Yochanan Mazakeh says, "Kan b'yom t'shecholis b'Shabbos, kan b'yom t'shecholis b'emtza Shabbos." The fact that it could be b'emtza Shabbos shows us that the Shabbos of Erev Shavuos, the emphasis is not on the Shabbos of Mekacha v'Kaima, but the emphasis is on the fact that it's a day of Sfiras HaEmer, which is Aveda b'Kayach Atzmei, which is a Hachana to Shavuos, which is ultimately the purpose of which is Chibur Elin V'Tachtein. We're able to bring the highest down and connect it with Aveda Samata. So this is what Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is telling the Baitusi. Says, you missed the point. You're trying to emphasize this idea that everything has to come Ilamayla. What you don't understand is that's not what Torah is all about. What Torah is all about is about Aveda Samata, Torah Shebel Peh, La Foshala, be Mechadis B'Torah. Torah say when it becomes part of the person's Torah. And when that happens, a person can connect himself with Yichud Nifla with the Eibishter, and a person could actually Tisperu Chamishim Yom, a person could affect positively to bring about the Gilui of the 50th day of Sharanun. That's the response to this suggestion of the Baitusi. And Avdema the Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai Siftes. Now we're going to explain how the pasuk, how the idea of the 40 years in the Midbar prove this point. We're gonna see the fact that the Yidden went through the Midbar 40 years. This gave them the opportunity for Aveda B'Kayach Atzmei, and that is the Avos Yisrael of Moshe Rabbeinu. That he gave them the opportunity to reach Eretz Yisrael through Aveda B'Kayach Atzmei. That's the deeper, most profound Avos Yisrael of Moshe Rabbeinu. That not instead of giving them the shortcut to Eretz Yisrael, but then it would be something that was given to them from above, and they would feel disconnected to it. He gave them the opportunity of Aveda B'Kayach Atzmei. That's true love. Siftes. And to prove this point, he brings it out from the fact that Moshe delayed them in the middle for 40 years. The ancient von Torah, even the punishments or the negative consequences in Torah, which is always a Torah of kindness. The punishments are not meant just to punish, to hurt, but they actually meant to refine the sinner and cleanse him from the blemish of the chet, of the Aveda. And this applies to this gezerah, this decree that the Yidden had to be in the middle for 40 years, as a tachlis from them is given the purpose of which was not so much to punish them for the sin of the Miraglim, to bring him by Eden but to bring out, to draw out from the Yid a stronger, deeper connection with Hashem. And certainly this will help to prevent them from transgressing once again a similar Aveda. So this cleansing process happened through all of the trials and tribulations that the Yidden experienced in the Midbar, in which they overcame. Als they tshuva getan, they did tshuva for them. Was das also der Weg bei Yid natifere iskasus mit Elokus. This awakened by the Yid a deeper connection with Hashem. Was kein Zach kann es nicht schon zu stellen, and nothing can destroy it. Similar to the Rambam explains that someone who overcomes a test, overcomes a nisoyin, it makes him stronger. It proves to him how strong he is and helps him stay strong in the future. Das heißt, and this explains to us, Davke die Greise Avas Yisrael from Moshe. Specifically because Moshe Rabbeinu had such an intense Avas Yisrael, hat ihm gebracht dazu, this led him to the fact that as Ovelen und Ton, Icheron, that he should cause this delay, as Eden soll nach reingehen in Eretz Yisrael, in Eretz, Asher Geimer Tamid, Ede Hashem Lekechaba, stehendig in der Darge von Advekim Hashem Lekechem, so that the Yidden should enter in Eretz Yisrael in a state of connected with Hashem, but das is geworden durch Zeravede V'Yegia, which happened through their own work and their own toil, their own effort. Sivuv unesiyas by midbar ha'amim, wandering and traveling in the midbar of the nations. Upwaschen dem chet ubgam midbar b'mishana, and that thus to wash off the blemish of the sin, and therefore they spent 40 years in the midbar. If you want a proof that Torah is about Aveda B'Kayach Atzmai, look what Moshe Rabbeinu did. They kept the Yidden in the middle of 40 years. This proves to us that Moshe Rabbeinu was giving them a chance to wash away the stain of any of the sins, to be able to do tshuva, and to be able to connect to Hashem on a totally different level, and to enter into Eretz Yisrael by doing something that they earned and deserved. They worked for it, and they got there through their own efforts. And I'll pick now, and now, according to this, we'll understand the pasuk Achad Asa Yom Echerev, and Dafka the Rashi explains it that it's either 3 days or 40 years. Based on this, we'll understand by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Use this pasuk specifically that there was 11 days from Cherev to Kadesh. Was there mita der gemeint wie Teisvus now, which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is trying to say, and as Teisvus explains earlier, if he wasn't Yisrael, they would have gone 40 years. And instead, they weren't successful to go. Well, they took them 3 days. Das was Eden, am gedarf durch in der Midbar zu kennen reingehen in Eretz Yisrael. Is given to them was durch Zeir and Nesiyas by Midbar Birf Midbar Amim and Zekinam Nes alle geworden. The fact that he didn't have to go through the Midbar to be able to go into Eretz Yisrael, it was for the purpose that through their travels in the Midbar and through their refining of the Midbar of the nations, they themselves were elevated. This prepared them and made them ready to go into Eretz Yisrael. This process, the journey through the Midbar and the refinement of the Midbar and the elevation of the Yid could have occurred in one of two ways. Aleph mitzad hashchinim elamayla. One, from the Eibishter's perspective, it would come from above. But in them then there are no limitations, no physical limitations. And therefore it could be done in a hasty, in a speedy way. On keina ikuvim, without any anything stopping it. But in them Eifen is as Nama de Kesufa. Nita in them der Uftu von Avedas Adam. But if it's coming from above, then it's called in Chassidus the usual term Nama de Kesufa, which means bread of shame. Bread of shame means something that you have that's unearned. It was given to you as a gift and you didn't deserve it. It's almost shameful because it's not something that you worked for. So on the one hand, they could have gone right through the Midbar, no time constraints, because it's coming from above. The Eibishter is doing all the work, but it still lacks the advantage of Avedas Adam. It's unearned. Based, the other way of doing this is mitzat Eden milamata. It would come from above. It would come from the preparation and the perspective of the Yidden. Was dan kedei alicha midbar zal uftan in Eden kedaboy. In order that the journey through the Midbar should affect the Yidden properly, that They had to delay it. They had to take the duration of 40 years. Dafke durch die alle Nesias und damit echt die Avedas and Nesienes, through all of this, the individual travels, journeys, and the trials that came along the way. It was therefore that this refinement was able to penetrate them in all aspects of their life. Und das hat Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gesagt in Baitusi, and this is the point Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is making to the Baitusi. Lishi Tosei, according to the Baitusi, according to the Baitusi, that everything is all about what comes from above, then he should have chosen the successful way to go. To hasten their arrival. Because you use so much angst, it should become easier for the Yidden. Von dem, was ich mit Amidbar Memshana is muchach, as the Avas Yisrael Amitis von Moshe hat sich ausgedrückt, Davke in dem, was zugebracht Yidden zu Aveda B'Keach Atzmam. And the fact that they were delayed 40 years in the Midbar, it shows that the true Avas Yisrael of Moshe was expressed in the fact that he led the Yidden, he brought them to a point where they could serve Hashem on their own, with their own efforts. That's the greatest gift that he could give them. Greater than taking them to the Midbar in 3 days, in 3 days was the gift of giving them the ability of Aveda B'Keach Atzmai. That's the greatest gift he can give them. And that is, in a certain sense, a fundamental, not in every sense, a fundamental difference between the Baitusim and Moshe and Teras Emes. And in a sense, we have that same argument today. Do I want to take the easy way out, the quick and easy way, or do I want to take the way that's harder, but the way that involves me, that I become part of it? It's a kav shaloi, and Moshe and his Avos Yisrael wants to give us the opportunity, even though it's difficult for him and difficult for us, but he wants to give us the opportunity to accomplish and to embrace the next step of the journey through something that, because of something that we worked on and we were successful at. Und der Fall ist der Pasuk Achad Asu Yemecherev, der Sachaka von der Friedeke Tevertechacha. And therefore it comes out that this Pasuk is the sum total of the previous words of Techacha. Was steht in the Friedeke Pasuk, which were mentioned in the previous Pasuk, was Yechichan Moshe She'evan, which Moshe, who loves them, is the one who's being given the task to rebuke them. Weil die Kavone von der Divrei Techacha is given to Uftan in Eden Aveda Utshuva Mitzat Atzmam. The Techacha that Moshe is giving them now is his final chance to give them the opportunity to be able to do their own Aveda and their own Tshuva. But thus is the time from the Alicha and Midbar by Mishana, which this is the reason why they were traveling in the Midbar. So after giving them all of the Techacha, Moshe says, remember that we could have done this in 3 days. Instead we did this in 40 years. You know why? So that you should be able to do Tshuva. So you should be able to have the Zichuch V'Aliyah of yourselves and a proper preparation to come into Eretz Yisrael. That was my gift to you, says Moshe right to the Yidden. The same thing could be said about the lengthiness of this final Galos. The Kavana therefore is to isolated in Eden. The purpose of the length of Galos is to be able to refine the Yidden and make them prepared, that also from themselves, they or we should be ready for the Geula. It's not just something that's going to be imposed upon us from above, but it's something that we are working for and we are working on, and therefore we will feel more connected to it because we're the ones who brought it about. The problem is that it's taking a very long time. In other words, it's true that we are being given an incredible opportunity, that the Geula should come through our efforts, but it's taking a very long time. So the Rebbe says over here, durch dem was Yidden eilen sich, in der Aveda in a Nefen von Zachu, but if Yidden will rush through the Aveda in a manner of Zachu, of being meritorious, then the Zichuch Gufa aufgetan in a Nefen von Achishena, then the Zichuch could be done in a quick way. And then the Geula comes with both advantages. Side from Be'ita, side that it comes in its time, meaning to say after the Aveda of the Yidden, but that is the Birul Tachlitz in Ala Pratim, which then it is a full-fledged Birur, encompassing every aspect of the Birur. Because Yidden did it in a rush, it brought about the Eivishter should rush the Geula, which means it's coming from above. So we have the Maila of the Birur of the Yidden. We also have the Maila of the fact that it's coming from above. Especially since all the Kitzin have already passed, and therefore we must have the Be'ita and the Achishena, and the Gula Amitis Vashlema, the Mashiach Zakenu, B'Meheda V'Menu Mamish, it should be Shlema, complete, and it should be B'Meheda, it should be speedily in our days.